View this video from the playlist to see the complete video content.
We're going to be threading the machine so that we can start to sew, but before we do that we need to talk about the posi pin. And you'll notice right now, if I turn the flywheel or even if I run the machine under power by pressing the foot pedal, that the flywheel rotates but the machine is not operating. That's because our posi pin is not engaged. To engage the posi pin, we simply pull the pin out of our posi pin keeper, which is really nothing more than a spot to hold the pin so you don't lose it. And we go through any of the 3 holes in the Power Plus wheel. There's only one hole in the Monster wheel if you have that, but we go through any of those holes, and you want to push it in until you feel it hit metal, apply light pressure, and rotate until it drops into one of the 4 holes on the posi pin bushing. And you can see once I push it in, I'll push in all the way and I'll let go and it'll spring out a little bit, and that is in position. So again, I'm going to show you that one more time. Pull the pin, put it in so that it's hitting metal, rotate, and we just found another hole. And it doesn't matter which hole you're in, but once we have that in place, now when I turn the wheel, you'll notice that the mechanisms of the sewing machine start to operate. We are engaged. So that is how we engage the posi pin. Now I don't want to run it under power right now because I have my sample under the foot and I have just a very short piece of thread running through the machine. This is the thread that we left in the machine after we did our test sewing to make sure that your machine is perfect. So let's take a look at the thread path before we remove the sample so that you have a general idea of what we're going to do next, which is threading. Let's remove the sample of material from under the foot. I'm going to move our light out of the way so you can see what's going on here. So I'm going to lift the presser foot. This lever, you'll feel it has no resistance on it until you get to the lift point, and I'll push it back until it locks into place, and that lifts my foot. Now what I want to do is take the flywheel and I want to rotate it either backwards or forward until the needle is all the way up. I know the needle's all the way up when this take-up arm is all the way at the top of its travel. Once that's like that, there's a little piece of tape holding our thread back here on the end plate, and I'm going to remove that little piece of tape because we don't need that. And that gives me just the loose tail of thread here. Now remember, we've already looked at the thread path so that we have some idea what we're going to be doing here, but now what I do is I'm just going to rotate my flywheel so that I can get my very heavy sample of Nulga fabric out from under the foot, and I'm simply going to pull it until the top thread comes completely free of the machine. And we do not need this sample anymore, so we'll just set it aside. At this point, what I want to do in order to show how to pick up the bobbin thread is I'm going to actually pull the bobbin thread back down to the bottom side of the machine. So to pull it out, just lift this finger, pull out, pull the thread free, put it back in with the finger held out, and then drop the finger and tap on it to make sure it's in place. Now we are ready to thread the machine. Your machine comes with a cone of V92 weight thread, which is appropriate for heavier canvas work. And we have unbagged this thread already. It simply goes on the post of our integrated thread stand or on the post of your standard thread stand if that's what you have with the basic package, and then up through the grommet of the thread stand or through the loop of the metal arm of the standard thread stand. And then you want to lead the thread over to the spool pin, and you want to go the most direct path to the next threading device, and that would be the top hole in this case, but it varies from machine to machine, so the most direct path. Next, we want to go through the pigtail loop right here, and you'll notice the best way to do it is hold the thread diagonally and then just spin it in a counterclockwise direction into the loop. Once I'm in the loop, now I'm going to come down to the 3-hole ear on the machine, and I'm going to go down through the rightmost hole, around the front, and then down from the top through the leftmost hole, and this will create, if I can grab that thread, sort of a candy stripe on that thread device. That helps to dekink the thread before it goes into the tension assembly. Next, we want to go through the tension assembly plates. And I'm going to remove the cover so that you can see this a little bit more clearly. To remove the cover, you just wiggle and pull this plastic cover off, there's another knob underneath, which is actually the threaded knob that controls the tension. With the presser foot up, you should be able to tell that there is a little bit of wiggle room in these plates. And the plates shape sort of a pulley V section. That's where the thread runs through. So you want to find that section, and then you want to pull the thread through from the right, underneath, and then underneath this take-up spring, and you can see I'm moving the take-up spring up and down now, and you want to pull on your loose end of your thread until the thread is trapped in this hook of the tension assembly, which activates the take-up spring. So what I'll do is I'll hold some tension on this thread end, and then I'll pull up on this, and you should have been able to hear it snap in place there. And notice how the thread is now coming through that hooked arm and then going under the take-up spring. And now when I pull on it, you can see that the take-up spring is actively doing its job. Now at this point, I can pull on the loose thread and it pulls fairly freely from the machine with very little resistance. If I drop my presser foot, you'll see that the plates now are tight together here, and if I pull on this thread, it's very tight. So that essentially shows you what happens on a sewing machine when you drop the presser foot, and that's how you get thread upper tension to create a proper knot in your fabric. But we want to lift that again to continue our threading. And now I'm going to rotate the flywheel clockwise, or from the top toward me. I'm going to rotate the flywheel until my take-up arm is all the way up at the top. When the take-up arm is at the top, I want to go through it from right to left. And now I want to bring the thread down, and there's a hole right at the top of the needle insertion point. I'm going to lower the needle so you can see it here, right there. And I'm passing the thread through that hole from front to back. And then I want to flip this thread under the cover, just like so. And the final piece we need to do to thread is we need to thread the needle. So I'm rotating the flywheel around the normal direction, won't hurt anything, in order to get my needle to a position where I can get from the eye of the needle from left to right. And this is a number 20 needle in the machine, so you see I really didn't have much trouble passing that thread through there because it's got a pretty good eye. And now I am ready to pick up the lower thread. To pick up the lower thread, I simply hold this tail loosely, and I'm going to again rotate the flywheel from the top toward me until the needle goes all the way down and then starts to come back up. And I can tell when it's starting to come back up because this take-up arm will start to rise. And when the take-up arm is about 3/4 of its travel up, I can pull on the loose thread and see this loop coming up. I've pulled the bobbin and I can pull it all the way up to the needle. But what I want to do here now is take my scissors or a screwdriver or something, pass it under the foot. You see how I'm pulling the loop? And I'm going to pull both threads. Pull both threads so that they're both between the bottom of the presser feet and the top of the needle plate. You can see them pulled there. When we get ready to sew, we're going to hold those off to the left back quarter of the sewing machine as they're positioned right now. My sewing machine is threaded, and the last thing that I want to do is I want to take the thread that is coming up from the bottom, and I want to pull on it and just make sure that it's pulling with good even tension. It should pull sort of like dental floss coming out of its container. And as long as it's not trapped or locked and it pulls with a consistent resistance, you're in good shape. Now let's put the cap back on and just press it in place, and everything is threaded and you're ready to sew. We also have our Ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine set up, threaded, and ready to sew as well. I want to point out that whether you have the red or the blue machine, the threading process is exactly the same. We should have enough bobbin in the machine to do a little sewing. So this is a marine grade red sunbrella, and I'm going to fold it in half so it's just 2 layers. And what I've done here is I've noticed I put it under the foot, and then I'm dropping the presser foot, and you see my natural inclination is to trap the threads here, and that's how you start to sew. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trap the threads for the first stitch or 2, and then I'm going to depress the foot pedal, and I'm going to start sewing along. And we'll just notice that that's very basic sewing that we're doing. But What we really need to talk about before we can go any further with sewing is some of the levers and controls, the various levers and controls on the sewing machines. And let me talk about two that are only on the LSZ1 machine. And that would be this lever, which is the left, center, and right lever, and this lever, which controls zigzag. So let's start with left, center, and right. And again, this is only on the zigzag machines. This is a gated lever, so if I try and move it, it's locked in unless I push it down and move it. And I only want to do this when the needle is up. So you'll notice my needle is up, and the reason for that is, let me rotate the needle so it goes down a little bit further so you can see what happens. When I push this lever down and move it, it moves the entire needle bar frame left, center, or right. So the idea here is to use this control to get a straight stitch closer to the outer side of either foot. So if I'm sewing next to a hard zipper or something, I can move it to the right to get my stitch in closer to the neck of the zipper tooth. Okay, if I move it to the left, I can get it closer to the opposite side. Center is where I normally want to be. The positioning of this lever will have no impact on this lever. So if I'm in the right position, this is my zigzag lever, if I'm in the right position, I'm all the way to the 0 reference, and that means I'm in straight stitch. As I move this lever to the left, and this one's not gated, it's just a stiff movement. As I move it to the left and all the way to its stop, I go from straight stitch to maximum zigzag width and anything in between. But what I was trying to say is that if this is in left, that doesn't impact it at all when this is in zigzag. This only functions when the mechanism here is set to straight stitch. So I usually leave this in center all the time unless I need to do a straight stitch on the right or the left. But we've already sewn a little bit of straight stitch. Let's move it to sort of a mid zigzag, and I'll sew a little bit. You can see what's happening is the needle bar is moving left and right in order to produce a stitch. If I move it even further, all the way off to the side, I'll get my full 5mm width zigzag stitch. The next lever we want to talk about is the Easy Set Stitch Length plate and lever. And this is a fairly new device for the Ultrafeed sewing machines. And what it does is it gives you the longest possible stitch in forward and reverse, and it leaves the lever spring loaded. So when I have it all the way to the top, it's full forward. All the way to the bottom is reverse. And when I release it, it springs back up to full forward. Plus I have these stops that I can slide up and down in order to create a different range of full forward and full reverse easily. So it gives you complete flexibility of the stitch length that you want. And for instance, now what I'm doing is sewing a shorter zigzag stitch, and you will see that in the results here. And when I push it into reverse, you'll see I'm also getting a shorter stitch in reverse. So easy to use mechanism. This mechanism is common between the Ultrafeed LSZ and the Ultrafeed LS1 sewing machine. They function exactly the same way. Now, with this mechanism, the one thing you want to keep in mind is that you don't want to make adjustments to it with the needle trapped in the surface of the material, especially when we're talking about thicker materials, because the foot can be in a position where it can actually pull the fabric and deflect the needle. So for now, until we get to a section where we discuss that more carefully, make sure that you always adjust this when the needle is all the way up or all the way down. In either position, you will not have any problems. So that's how you adjust the stitch length. A couple of other common adjustments on the machine. We've already talked a little bit about the lift for the presser foot, which is here. It's the same on both the red and the blue machine. We also have the tension assembly, which we showed a little bit earlier, but in general, turning it clockwise increases the amount of tension on the top to pull the knots to the top surface. Turning it counterclockwise decreases tension to allow the knots to fall to the underside of the fabric. And then the final adjustment, again common to both machines, would be the presser foot tension knob. And this thumb screw just allows you to control the amount of downward force that the feet apply to the feed dogs and the fabric on the sewing machine. We want more pressure for really hard, difficult to penetrate materials, and we want less pressure for really delicate materials and materials that are somewhat spongy and harder to feed in nature, so that we're not trapping and bogging the material under the feed. But this control should be set generally in roughly this position for almost all sewing. I don't normally mess with it unless I have a situation that requires an adjustment. So with those controls, I already have the presser foot up, and I just want to show that to remove the fabric, then I can just wiggle the flywheel a little bit with the take-up arm in its upper position, and as I do that I can pull the material out and snip my threads, and that's how I would remove my work. So those are the controls for both the Ultrafeed LSZ1 and the LS1 sewing machine. And as you can see, they're largely very common with the exception of these two controls. And we will get into greater detail on the use of the critical controls as we progress through this video. All right, let's do some sewing again. And this time I'm going to take some Pacific Blue Sunbrella and I'm going to turn it into a nice heavy 8-layer chunk of Sunbrella. And this marine grade exterior stuff is quite heavy, so 8 layers is quite a chunk to sew through. I'm going to drop my presser foot, and then remember we trap our threads, and then we can start to sew. Now, what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the #1 rule of thumb for making adjustments to the stitch length or the stitch width or the needle position. And that is you should always make those adjustments with the needle out of the fabric. This is just a rule of thumb because when the needle's out of the fabric, when I move my left, right, or center, or I change to my zigzag stitch, any movement in the needle bar related to the movement of these, or even when I reverse, any movement in the fabric, if my needle's not touching the surface of the material, my needle is not going to be deflected by the mechanical movements that I make via the levers. As a rule of thumb, make adjustments to the needle positioning, the stitch width, or the stitch length when the needle is completely out of the fabric. With all rules, there are exceptions, and this rule of the needle always out for adjustments is one of those where there are some exceptions. Let's say, for instance, you're sewing along and you reach a corner and you want to turn that corner. What I suggest there is rotate the flywheel until the needle is all the way down, so obviously a change of direction, lift the presser foot, and then pivot on the needle. Drop the presser foot, and then you can continue to sew. By doing this, you will achieve the best, sharpest corner turns, and that's quite easy. Now, if I'm just sewing along and I need to change directions gradually, I can do that just by twisting the material. And I can twist sharper if I'm going faster. The other thing, though, is that if you want to reverse, you can do the same thing. So another exception, needle all the way down in the material instead of all the way up. Now I can push down on the reversing lever and I can reverse from that point. The other thing is that while I'm under speed, I can actually change the stitch length as long as the machine is operating fast enough that there's a rare possibility of the needle being caught in the material while the fabric is still moving. So those would be exceptions for turning corners and for stitch length where you might want to make adjustments with the needle down. As far as the zigzag width, there's really no exception. You only want to make that adjustment when the needle is out of the fabric, as I'm doing here. But if I want to turn a corner, again, I would bury the needle so that I have it buried on one of the points of the zig and then continue. Gradual movements I can do under power. Reversing I can do under power, or again, bury the needle, put it in reverse, and then go forward. If I want to come forward again, bury the needle, go into forward, and then allow the machine to operate in the forward direction. Left, right, and center should only be done with the needle up because this has to be in straight stitch. This does actually move the needle bar frame rather dramatically. If I were to do that with the needle down, you can see what would happen. Notice that I'm trying to move the bar and the needle is bending in the fabric. The reason we don't want to do that is that if you're bending the needle, you would be likely to potentially drive the needle into something metal that it shouldn't be driven into down below. So those are the general rules for when to make adjustments to the stitch length and width based upon the needle position. I also want to show you on the straight stitch machine, just really briefly, that the process is the same. We just don't have the zigzag capability. Okay, so I'm going to trap my threads like I always do after I've dropped my presser foot. And now I can sew along. When I reach a corner and I want to turn, I bury the needle, lift the presser foot, and pivot on the needle position. Same thing for reverse, bury the needle. Now I can go into reverse, go forward, bury the needle, and now I can go forward. I said forward before, but I meant back. Okay? And under speed, I can adjust the length of the stitch, but that's not really a very practical thing to do. And of course, with both machines, under speed, you can reverse and come forward again without any problems to lock your stitches.